right, and now I'll try the sharing again. So are you all seeing the first page of the presentation? Can you see the native trees and shrubs?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes.
great. All right, thank you. All right. So if you've been to some of my presentations before, you know my origin story of how I got started on native plants. I used to be a newspaper editor of a community newspaper in Oakville, and I started getting some phone calls back in 2003 about trees that were being taken down in parks and ravines and weren't being replanted. And when I called the town of Oakville and I asked them why the trees weren't being replanted, they said, "Oh, we just don't have money for that." And so when I hung up the phone, I thought, you know what, this is something I could do something about. So I called 12 of my friends and I asked them if they'd help me plant trees, and they said yes. And then I called this group called Evergreen that now runs the Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto, but at the time they were helping communities do community tree plantings. And I asked them if they would provide me with some expertise and if they would help me get funding, and they said yes. And then I called the town of Oakville and I said, look, I've got 12 friends who want to help me plant trees on public land. I've got Evergreen who's going to provide some funding and they're going to provide some expertise. And I know exactly where I want to start planting, and all I need you to do is say yes. And I thought it took them 3 weeks to decide that that would be okay. And I thought that took a really long time, but now I realize that was actually a really short time. And so we got started planting. And over the next 10 years, we ended up planting 17,000 native trees and shrubs all around Oakville's parks. And that led to a whole bunch of other things. We got involved in changing policies at the town. We got them to commit to naturalizing 25% of their parks. We got a really strong tree bylaw. So all kinds of good things came out of that original tree planting plan. In 2004, I left the newspaper business and I became the president of a local environmental group there called Oakville Green. And Oakville Green evolved too into all kinds of different advocacy things, but also the educational programs that we provide that we ended up taking out and becoming a charity, which is called Ontariogreen. So what is a native plant? Well, a native plant is a plant that was here before settlement. So it's a kind of plant that has evolved here over the millennia and that supports our native wildlife. Without native plants, we can't have healthy ecosystems here. Native plants are important, as I said, because they support our local wildlife. They feed the insects and larvae that in turn feed our songbirds. They provide berries for birds and small mammals, and they provide nuts and seeds and forage for many kinds of animals. And that beautiful moth, if you don't know it, is a Luna moth, which I haven't actually seen since I was a child, but I've planted a lot of trees in my yard that support Luna moths, and I'm really hoping I get to see one again. One striking example of how important native plants are is, and I use it all the time, so if you've seen the presentations by me before, you'll recognize this. I always talk about the Norway maple. So Norway maples were widely planted. They're about 14% of the tree canopy in our municipalities in southern Ontario, and they support 2 native species. By contrast, a white oak or any one of our native oaks supports almost 500 native species. Everything from the smallest little larvae that eat the leaves and then in turn feed our songbirds to big things like squirrels, of course, and also deer and black bear and other mammals that eat the acorns. So when we plant the non-native plants that don't support our local things, it's almost like we're creating these holes in our environment. So benefits to gardeners from planting native plants in general: native plants aren't fussy and therefore they require less care. They evolve to thrive in our local conditions. In general, not all the time because some plants prefer wetter areas, but in general they require less watering. And they will also attract all kinds of life to your garden. And I can testify to this because when we first bought our property here in Vineland about 14 years ago now, it was mowed grass right down to the ravine. And ever since, I have been naturalizing the property. So I've planted tons of native plants. I've put in lots of native flower gardens. And whereas we hardly used to see anything, any kind of wildlife, any pollinators, any butterflies, anything on the property when we first moved in, Now we've had everything from bald eagles to coyotes to snakes to frogs. I mean, you name it, we've seen it in our yard. And all kinds of butterflies and all kinds of pollinators. So when you plant native plants, you can plant them as formally or informally as you like. It doesn't have to look wild. It can look very controlled and contained. And you don't need to be a purist. It's not all or nothing. It's a gradual shift for me from what was here to a more native, natural setting. And it can be that way for everybody. But we should all try and plant some native plants. All right, so let's talk about some of the native trees that we can use. So a tulip tree is one of my favorite trees. I planted one on my front lawn about 11 years ago, and it's as tall as the house now. It loves sandy soil, and it likes sunny places, and it's just sprung up like crazy. Turns a beautiful golden color in the fall. It's an important tree for bees and moths. It's one of the best trees for removing pollution out of the air, and that's partly because it has such a significant canopy, but also the leaves are very large. I've had leaves on my tree that are as large as dinner plates. It's a really excellent shade tree. It's not susceptible to many pests or diseases, and it can live up to 400 years. The wood was used by Indigenous people to make canoes. It gets these beautiful flowers, but what I've tended to see on my trees is that it flowers at the top. So a lot of times it's hard to see the trees or the flowers unless you're really looking up. And you can see why they call it a tulip tree when you see the kinds of flowers that it has. Another tree that I've planted in my yard is black cherry. It likes full sun. It'll tolerate a variety of soils and various kinds of moisture. It's pretty fast growing. It doesn't get super huge. It can get up to 22 meters. It has white blossoms in the spring, and it makes these dark red bitter cherries in the fall. And the berries are a really important food source for many birds. And as you can see, the flowers are a source of food for many different types of butterflies and other pollinators. This is what a nice old one looks like as it fills out and spreads. You can see it can get quite wide. I mentioned white oaks when I was talking about the difference between planting native and non-native species. This is a famous white oak actually from Oakville that they were going to take down. It was a 250-year-old oak, one of only 5 trees in all of Oakville that was over 200 years old. And they were going to take it down to widen the road, and a retired school teacher fought to save it, and she convinced the region not to tear it down. So now when you're driving down Bronte Road in Oakville, it looks like it's in the middle of the road, which it is because the road goes around it. But white oaks, as with any kind of native oak, great food source for all kinds of different wildlife. White oaks prefer full sun. They get to be really big, and they can have quite a spreading canopy, so you can only plant them in places where you have the room for them. They're tolerant to various kinds of soils and also various moisture. They don't grow really fast, but they do grow really big, so they can grow up to 35 meters, and they can live 500 plus years. In ideal conditions, a white oak can live to be 800 years old. A really great tree that I think doesn't get enough attention is our native bur oak. And the reason I like it so much is because it is so tolerant of every kind of condition. It's slow growing, but it can get huge, up to 50 meters in height, and it can live up to 400 years. It's a great source of food, again, for many different kinds of animals. Now, it doesn't produce acorns every year. And one of the things with many kind of oak trees and other nut trees is they do something called masting. So many years they won't produce many acorns, and then when they do produce acorns, they produce thousands and thousands of them. And it's a strategy so that they produce so much that all the squirrels and all the things that like to eat nuts just can't eat them all. And so the nuts have a better chance of being able to produce new trees. So it's an evolutionary survival strategy to help them reproduce. Northern hackberry is another tree that I have planted in my yard. It will tolerate a range of sun, from full sun to partial shade, tolerates all different kinds of soils. It likes moist conditions, but it can adapt. It's pretty fast growing. It only grows up to 15 meters. It's a good replacement for elm trees. And it's a good shade tree. It also grows as wide as it grows tall, so you need space for it. And it has a fruit that supports many different kinds of birds, and there's lots of different caterpillars that feed on its leaves. And in the fall, it turns a bright yellow color. Red oak is another great native oak. It can tolerate some shade, so unlike a lot of varieties of oak, it doesn't need necessarily full sun. Tolerates a variety of moisture and soil. It grows up to 30 meters. Again, like most oaks, it needs room to grow. It will hang on to its dead leaves through the winter, so it provides some winter interest. And again, great for pollinators and great for feeding many different species. The Freeman maple isn't a pure native tree. It's actually a cross between a silver maple and a red maple? I think a silver maple and a red maple. And it's, yeah, it says that right there. Okay. And it prefers full sun. It likes well-drained soils. It'll tolerate, again, various moisture conditions. It grows to 24 meters, and it has this beautiful bright red color. This is a tree that's become very popular for municipalities to plant. It's disease and pest resistant. And it, again, like many of our native trees, provides good cover for birds, for their nests, and it attracts also a lot of pollinators. One of the things I didn't know about, So the sugar maple is the most shade tolerant of deciduous trees. So if you're looking for a tree that will work in your yard, if you have a lot of shade already, you might consider this one. It doesn't like salt, so it's not a great tree to put at a roadside. It's able to pull up moisture from deep down in the soil, and it helps provide moisture to other things that are growing around it. That's what that hydraulic lift is about. It's pretty fast growing. It grows up to 35 meters, and it can live up to 400 years. The color in the fall is outstanding, and it provides lots of food for insects and larvae. I think everyone knows that comfort maple that's in the picture there. This is an endangered tree here in Niagara, but you can buy them and plant them. I've planted several in my yard, the cherry birch. There was a stand near St. Catharines of about 14 trees, and I think 12 of them ended up getting blown down in a windstorm a few years ago. So anything that we can do to help propagate this tree is important. Likes full sun, prefers moist, well-drained soils. It's fast growing. It doesn't get too huge. It gets up to 20 meters, and it can live for 200 years. So if you're looking for a birch, this is actually a better choice than the paper birch, which doesn't like heat or humidity and doesn't actually usually do very well in this area. And especially given changing climate conditions, this is a much better choice than a paper birch. Now, the bark you're seeing on the tree in the picture there is brown, and that's how my trees started out. But now we're starting to see, as they're maturing, we're starting to see the peeling of the bark, and it looks more like you'd expect a birch to look. So the trees are self-pollinating. You don't have to plant more than one. It's a source for birch beer and also oil of wintergreen, which is used as a preservative and also as a medicinal rub. And it can be tapped just like sugar maples, but the resulting syrup is more like molasses. Feeds dozens of butterflies and moths, like this white admiral that you're seeing in the picture. I don't know, have any of you tasted pawpaws?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, so pawpaw again is sort of a rare native tree that's unique to the Carolinian area of Ontario, which is the southern part of Ontario where we are. Again, I've planted 2 of these trees in my yard, and they're springing up all over the place because the seeds get spread around. But it forms a, oh, I think I've got a picture of the fruit in the next slide. Yeah, I do. Okay. So it prefers part shade to full shade. Not too many trees like that. It likes rich, loamy soils. It prefers wet to moist soils. It's fast growing. It only gets to 10 meters. And it produces maroon bell-shaped flowers in the spring and abundance of palm-sized green-purple fruits in the fall. And the fruit is insect and disease resistant, and I can attest to that. The only time that anything eats that fruit is once it's fallen off the tree and is laying on the ground, then the ants will start getting to it. But on the tree itself, there's no insect or pest problems. So that's what the flowers look like. That's what the fruit looks like as it's ripening. And then the picture on the bottom right-hand side is the ripe fruit. So it's got this really creamy texture. It's almost like pudding. You can just put a spoon in it and scoop it out and eat it. It's got these big black seeds in there. Now they say it tastes like a combination of banana, mango, and cream. My husband loves them. I'm finding it's an acquired taste. It's just different. It's different than anything else that you've tasted. So witch hazel is the only tree in North America to have flowers and ripe fruit and next year's leaf buds on its branches at exactly the same time. It prefers partial shade, but it'll grow in full sun. And it likes moist, well-drained soils. Now, I've planted witch hazel probably 4 times, and I only have 1 surviving, and that's because rabbits seem to love them. So I plant them, and even though I try and put guards on them and stuff, they get chewed down. So I suggest if you want to plant a witch hazel, that you fence it really well against rabbits and other things, excuse me, in its early years. They don't get too tall, they only grow to 8 meters, and they have a really beautiful color in the fall. Excuse me for 1 second. So if you're looking for an evergreen, an eastern hemlock is something to consider. It's very shade tolerant. It'll tolerate a variety of soils. It prefers moisture, it's slow growing, and it grows to about 30 meters. Indigenous people made many kinds of medicine from its twigs and bark. It's a good tree to plant in large stands because it enhances wildlife habitat. So one of the things you will find is that deer will use the cover of the branches to get shelter in the winter. It's also a great tree for nests for birds. Another kind of evergreen is the eastern red cedar. They like full sun. They'll tolerate dry soil in harsh conditions. Excuse me. They also tolerate salt, so they can be grown along driveways or walkways. They don't require a lot of watering. In fact, they don't like a lot of watering. They do better if you don't water them. They're fairly slow growing. They grow to 5 to 10 meters, and they're a great nesting site for birds. Cedar waxwings will eat the berries, and there's also many pollinators that enjoy them. If you're looking for a low-growing native evergreen, you might consider the common juniper. It likes full sun. It will put up with sandy and rocky soils. It's drought tolerant. It can grow 1.5 meters, but it often grows low and spreading. The berries are eaten by birds. It's deer resistant. And the berries of the juniper are used to flavor gin, to flavor meat, and for stuffings and sauces. And the berries, again, have many medicinal uses. I love my eastern redbuds. I planted 2 of them, and they look gorgeous in the in the spring. And the color of the blossoms is really stunning. They don't last too long. The blossoms only last for a week or 2. But they're a magenta color. They like full sun to partial shade. They'll tolerate a variety of soils and moisture conditions. They're fairly fast growing. And usually you'll see that they're multiple stems, at least mine are multiple wide branching out. Native people used to roast and eat the seeds, and the twigs have been used to season food. Now, staghorn sumac, I was entranced by as a kid because it was the only tree I knew that seemed to have fur on its branches. So most of us know staghorn sumac. We've seen it growing. I love them beside my porch because it looks tropical. You know, when I'm out there in the summer, it almost looks like a palm tree out there. The problem with staghorn sumac is that they just spring up all over because they come up from the roots. As long as you're willing to continuously mow the shoots that are springing up and cut them down, you can keep it under control. But they do tend to spread, so that's the problem with them. Now, again, if you're trying to naturalize an area and you want something that will spread, staghorn sumac is ideal for that. And they get brilliant red color in the fall, so they can really look quite stunning. One of the things I've noticed is the berries that they produce are not a favorite of birds. They stay on the plants usually all winter, and when I see the birds eating them, it's early in the spring when the birds are just coming back. That's when they'll go after the berries. So it's not their favorite thing, but it provides sustenance when they need it early in the spring before many other things are available. If you're looking for something fairly small but that has a lot of punch, red osier dogwood is a great plant to grow. It grows best in full sun, but it can tolerate some shade. It will tolerate a variety of soils. It likes moist sites, and it's tolerant of flooding, but it can grow in drier areas. It's pretty fast growing. It grows only up to 1.2 meters. It has white flowers in the spring and white berries in the fall. The berries feed dozens of birds, and it's a really important food source for birds during migration, and also for small mammals. And the flowers are an important source of pollen for honeybees. The thing I like about it is it provides some winter interest in the garden because the red stands out so nice against the snow. Downy serviceberry is a great smaller tree. It will grow in partial shade to full sun. It'll tolerate a bunch of different soil and moisture conditions. It's fairly fast growing, grows to 12 meters. It makes small white blooms in the spring and then reddish purple berries. Those berries are edible, so humans can eat them, but they're also loved by birds. And so unless you get up really early in the morning, you're not going to get any ripe ones. As you can see here, berries popular with the birds, and in the fall, downy serviceberry gets a brilliant red color. Nannyberry is, almost sort of more of a bush than it is a tree. It's partial to sun and partial shade. Partial sun to partial shade is what it will grow in. It tolerates a variety of soils and moisture. It's medium fast growing, grows up to 7 meters, produces white blossoms in spring, and has really great fall color. Again, nannyberry berries are edible for humans, but they're also loved by all kinds of birds. The plant's liked by pollinators, and the seeds feed all kinds of different creatures. Eastern flowering dogwood is another endangered species for our area. It grows best in eastern or understory conditions where it has shelter from the afternoon sun. It likes even moisture. It's a slow growing tree. It only grows up to 10 meters. But over 50 species of birds and small mammals eat its seeds, which are poisonous to humans. It's a great alternative to burning bush. In fact, I wish they'd stop selling burning bush. This is a really great plant. It's not always easy to find, and I always recommend when you're going to nurseries, take the Latin name with you, because so many of the native plants have been hybridized, and I always recommend trying to find the original native plant, because when they're breeding a plant for a certain shape or a certain type of flower or a certain color, you don't know what they're breeding out. And sometimes they're breeding out its ability to produce pollen or nectar or berries. You never know what impact it's having on its original usefulness to the environment. So I always suggest that you get the Latin name and you make sure you're getting that exact species. Black elderberry, another tree that I've planted around my property. They say it likes full sun, but I've planted in areas that have partial shade and it seems to be doing well. It's pretty fast growing. It'll grow up to 3 meters and it can get quite wide. It's, I would say, wider than it is tall for sure. It gets these dark berries on it that are edible. But again, you have to get there before the birds do. Spice bush is another terrific plant. It likes understory conditions, so shade. And I have a lot of shady spots in my property, so I've planted spice bush there. It's pretty fast growing. It doesn't get too high though. 3.7 meters is as tall as it'll get. It can form thickets, although I haven't noticed that with my plants. They don't seem to be spreading. Produces yellow blooms in the spring and bright red fruits in the fall. The leaves turn a bright showy yellow in the fall, and it has a citrus odor. So if you break one of the branches and you smell it, it'll smell like citrus. Many animals feed on its leaves and twigs, and it's a favorite plant for the spice bush swallowtail. And also for the silk moth, which again, you know, I said I haven't seen a Luna moth since I was a kid. I haven't hardly seen a Cecropia moth or any of the silk moths much since I was a kid. So I keep planting these things around my property, hoping I'm going to see these guys again. 9-bark, again, is a smaller kind of tree, only grows to 3 meters. It likes from sun to partial shade, prefers sand and loamy soils. It'll tolerate a variety of moisture. It's drought tolerant. It has showy white cream kind of pink blooms, and it will create thickets if you let it. The seeds are eaten by birds and many other kinds of animals. That again, 9-bark has been hybridized, so I suggest you take the Latin name if you're looking for 9-bark and make sure that you get the native one. Downy arrowwood is a member of the honeysuckle family. There's a lot of honeysuckle that is invasive in our area and growing all over the place. It didn't come from here originally, but this is a native member of the honeysuckle family. It likes part shade to full sun. It likes well-drained soils. It'll tolerate drought. It's fast growing, grows to 1.5 meters. The leaves turn a vibrant red in the fall, and it produces berries for birds. It attracts pollinators, and it makes a good nesting habitat. So those are just some of the native trees and shrubs that you might want to consider if you're wanting to add native plants to your garden. Native plants support the entire web of life in an ecosystem. So a big thank you from all the new life about to be born because of your interest in keeping our habitat healthy. Here's a few things in our local area. You can find the Niagara Native Gardening Club on Facebook. That's a group that Verna Fleming started in Beamsville, and it's attracted folks from all around the region. If you're interested in learning more about Ontariogreen, there's our website there. And there's also a group called Biodiversity and Climate Action Niagara, which is a collective of more than 21 different groups and dozens of individuals from around Niagara region who are working to improve biodiversity and to get policies and practices that will help increase biodiversity and also take action on the climate crisis. And you can find them on Facebook. And that is it for the slideshow. And I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hi, it's Bev speaking.
Yes.
I'm wondering, we currently in Smithville have one tree per property in the Boulevard area. Have you seen any places that allow more than one boulevard tree? And is there a reason for that?
So with boulevard trees, there's a bunch of issues with boulevard trees. But the main one, and one of the reasons you wouldn't necessarily want to put too many trees in a boulevard, is that trees require, for their health, they require a certain quality and quantity of soil. So
Right.
if there's too many trees in a boulevard, and depending on the size of the boulevard, you might be sort of endangering the health of both of them because neither of them is getting enough soil that they need. But the other problem in our boulevards is, and I don't know of any, there might be, and I just don't know about it, but I don't know of any municipality in Niagara that has rules around soil quality and quantity for the planting of boulevard trees. That is something that we fought for and got in Oakville. So there is now a standard that is absolutely required of developers. You can't just throw all the junk from the road building into the boulevard and then try and stick a tree in it and expect it to grow. Now they are required to provide a certain quality and quantity of soil, and that is enforced. And so that helps with the health of boulevard trees.
How did you get that implemented? I live in a new development in Smithville. It's about 5 years old, and I can tell you the soil is horrible. Mine in particular had been part of the construction site where they kept the trailer, etc. So it's especially the boulevard, it's mainly gravel. And then there's a very small amount of soil on top. So I have a beautiful oak on the boulevard. I'm concerned that it's not going to be able to survive. Um, how can we make sure that that changes for new developments that go on in the area?
What it took in Oakville was a lot of lobbying. It took more than that. I mean, it took us doing tree planting and getting citizens interested in trees and in improving the environment. And it took us doing forest walks, urban forest walks. It took us lobbying councilors. It took us taking councilors and MPPs out for urban forest walks. It took a time and it took a lot of effort. But all of the things that we did combined bought us credibility with the counselors, and then we approached them with these sort of practical policies. If you want a healthy urban forest, you have to put policies in place that will allow for that. Like, for instance, requiring certain quality and quantity of soil for street trees. The other thing that we lobbied for was requiring developers to put back topsoil on new developments. Because as you know, when they're doing a new development, the first thing they do is they scrape off all the topsoil.
Yes,
Topsoil is where all the life is and all the
yes,
nutrition is, right? So they scrape that all off, and then we're left with subsoil, and then they compact it because they're driving their heavy equipment over it.
yep.
And so we're left with compacted subsoil. And I know in Oakville, there was at the time, it's older now, but there was like a 30, 35-year-old development where you could see the street trees look stunted. And it was a sort of major road, third line, if you know Oakville. It was along third line. And there were lots of trees planted, but they all look like miniature trees still after 30 years. And so the city went and they had an urban forester. They had an urban forestry department in Oakville, and the urban forester started taking soil samples around the trees to see what was going on. And what he found was in some areas the soil was harder than cement. And when they started digging around the trees, what they found is the roots couldn't get out. The roots had just encircled the trees.
Oh,
And
okay.
so
Rainbow buds.
they ended up doing some experiments where they actually built these radial trenches out from the trees, and they pulled some of the roots out into the trenches, and they filled the trenches with good soil just to see if that would help the trees grow. And it did help. I mean, the trees were never going to achieve what they could have achieved if they'd been planted in decent soil, but it did help them grow. But you can't go and retroactively try and fix all that. You've got to
No,
put policies in place to ensure that you have the soil that will allow trees to thrive. So one of the things that we got in Oakville was a requirement for developers to put 36 inches of topsoil back in their developments. They took it away, they can bring it back. And they'll scream and yell and make all kinds of noise about it. But
yes,
How else are we going to get good urban tree growth?
The other question I had is how do you get um, the regional parks people involved in this and on board? What I've seen is there's a lot of plantings that go on, but unfortunately they're not putting in native plants. I don't think that they have been educated, and I'm not sure how to help.
Again, it takes, a lot of lobbying. It takes citizens pushing. That's what it takes. And, I've been working for years here in my town of Lincoln. One of the first things I did within the first year I was here, I asked to see the tree list that they gave to developers and said, these are the trees you can plant. And I was just horrified to see what was on that list and what was left off that list. And
Yeah.
13 years, almost 14 years later, I'm still kind of working on it. But I think the town of Lincoln is changing and is trying to address that. But it's citizens pushing their town. Most of our communities, I don't even know of one community. Maybe there is, and I just don't know of it. But I don't know of one in Niagara who has an urban forester on staff or who has a forestry department. Usually forestry is lumped into parks, and parks staff, God love them, are about gardens and mowing lawns in general. They're not urban foresters.
No.
So that's a problem at the local municipal level. We just don't have the expertise on staff. So it's about gaining credibility with your locally elected officials so that they understand that you actually know something about what you're talking about, and that there's a better way of doing things, and that putting the right policies in place can make a big difference.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question. Obviously, I'm English and I love my English country garden sort of effect. But as I'm going to redo all my, redo the gardens, I hope this year, this fall, and a little bit next year. Um, I what smaller shrubs do you think that I could would be native shrubs could I use to be the backdrop of or the flowering shrubs? Either or, it doesn't really matter.
So the native nine bark is not a big tree. It's a shrub. Serviceberry, as far as
Yeah.
trees go, it doesn't get huge either. Um, and it has a nice sort of openness about it. It doesn't have a thick canopy. So it's the kind of tree that you can plant and then you can plant under other things underneath and they'll do well. So serviceberry might be a taller one that you would consider, but it's not too tall. And then things like nine bark, and then things under that like dogwood.
Yeah, I have
Um,
dogwood. I have a white oak actually. I have about six trees in my garden. I have a white oak and I have two maples, a fir, and I don't know what the other one. It's another one as well.
what kind of maples do you have? Do you know?
I think they're red maples.
Okay. One of the things I was surprised at, I have a big old silver maple outside my side door that was here when the house was built, so it's well over 120 years old. And one of the things I was really surprised at is I came out really early in the spring one day and the whole tree was buzzing, and that's because it was absolutely filled with bees. And I didn't know until I saw that silver maples provide some of the earliest food for pollinators in the
Hmm.
spring. I'm not sure if other maples come out that early, but I know silver maples are a really great tree for pollinators because they're open. The blooms are open on those trees before anything else is really around.
I live in one of the downtown streets in Fonthill, so we have the big maples of really. I live in a turn of last century home, I have to say now. So the maples are as old as they were put in maybe 1910, maybe even earlier. I don't know. So it's an ongoing fight to make sure that they stay not cut down. So
Well,
we have a lot of
I hope
shade.
you win that fight.
Well, yeah, actually, the person who's fighting lives on my street, but I'm going to get involved now. I have a little more time. I'm going to start to get more involved.
What community did you say you were in?
Fonthill.
Montiel. Okay, so there is a group in Pelham called Path.
Yes, they're the ones that he lives on my road, Mike.
Okay.
He lives at the bottom of my road.
All right, anything else? No? All right, well, if there's nothing else,
Where will you post the video recording?
I will put it on Ontariogreen's Facebook page
Okay.
if I can. I don't know if it'll be too big for there.
You'll have to link the Zoom link. You can link the
Yeah,
Zoom.
that's what I'll have to do. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go.
And
I'll
Liz,
do
you don't mind if we share this video
No,
to
I
other
don't mind.
groups?
Don't mind.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
That's great. That was really good. I really enjoyed that. I'm glad I found it at the last minute.
Well, good luck on creating your garden.
Thank you. It's
And
always a pleasure to do that.
And thank you to everybody for coming out. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Liz. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks for the presentation. It was wonderful. I'm glad you actually went through with it, even though there weren't many of us here.
Yes.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Well.
Liz. Bye-bye.